Over the Solomon Islands, the air is impossibly clear, the kind of clarity pilots both admire and fear. The sun glints off the ocean, turning it to glass, and the Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy's Zero squadrons scan that vast blue expanse for prey. For 2 years, they have owned these skies. To them, the air above the Pacific is not a battlefield. It is an empire. Then they see them. Below, a formation of aircraft moves with an unfamiliar rhythm. Their wings are crooked, bent like the gulls that skim the surf. The paint is strange too. Not the drab gray of naval aircraft, but deep, gleaming blue. One Zero leader squints, smiles. "A new American model," he says over the radio. "Too heavy to fight." The others laugh. They have seen this before, bulky, awkward designs that turn too slow and climb too late. The laughter lasts until they dive. The first pass should have been easy, the Zeros dropping like arrows toward their targets, light and precise. But the blue-winged planes turn sharply, impossibly, rolling through the attack. Tracer fire slices the air, and 2 Zeros vanish in smoke before the Japanese pilots can react. The survivors pull back into the sun, their instincts shaken. They dive again, and once more, the strange machines rise to meet them, climbing with a power that defies their weight. Within minutes, the battle has inverted. The hunters have become the hunted. The radio chatter dissolves into confusion, disbelief. "They climb like demons," one pilot gasps before vanishing into the sea. When the few survivors return to base, their reports are fragmented, uncertain. They speak of aircraft that shouldn't exist, planes too fast to chase, too strong to outturn, and too vicious to escape. None can explain how the Americans, who had always built for strength rather than grace, now possess both. The legend of the Corsair begins not with triumph, but with shock, a weapon born from rejection, now writing its name across the Pacific sky. Fade out. 2 years earlier, the same machine had been laughed out of the Navy's hangars. Too wild to trust, too dangerous to fly. 2 years before the Solomon Islands, the aircraft that would terrify Japan was an embarrassment. On paper, it was revolutionary. The fastest single-engine fighter ever designed for the U.S. Navy. In practice, it was chaos with wings. Pilots called it names that no blueprint could redeem. The Ensign Eliminator, the Widowmaker, the plane nobody wanted. Its creator, the Chance Vought Aircraft Company, had delivered brilliance too far ahead of control. The Corsair's problem was not its heart, but its manners. At the center of that heart lay the Pratt & Whitney R2800. A 2,000-horsepower monster, the most powerful radial engine of its time. It gave the plane unmatched speed, a roar that rattled hangars, and a climb that defied gravity. But the same power that made it soar also made it vicious. The long nose blocked a pilot's view, the landing gear sat high and narrow. On carrier decks, it bounced like a skipping stone, shearing off wingtips and breaking pride along the way. Test crews begged for redesigns. Engineers trimmed wings, adjusted flaps, added weights to tame the beast. Nothing seemed to work. One test pilot said it wanted to fly everywhere except straight. On calm seas, it still struck fear. In rough ones, it became lethal. The Navy, exhausted by the risk, made its decision. The Corsair would not join the fleet. It was powerful, yes, but unpredictable. And in war, unpredictability could not be trusted. Yet war has a way of finding a use for what others discard. The Marines, desperate for an edge over the Zero, looked past its flaws. They saw potential where others saw peril. They trained, adapted, and built new ways to land it on jungle airstrips instead of decks. The aircraft that had been rejected by the sea found its destiny on land. In that rejection lay its rebirth. The Corsair was no longer the Navy's problem. It was the Marines' weapon, and soon the skies that had mocked it would tremble beneath its wings. Fade out. On a rain-soaked island in the Pacific, mechanics gather around a bent-winged machine that still smells of factory paint, unaware they are about to meet the monster in the clouds. The Marines met their new machine in the steaming jungles of the South Pacific, a place where every landing strip was carved from mud, coral, and determination. The Corsair arrived in crates, its blue paint still smelling of factories half a world away. Mechanics assembled it beneath palm trees, wiping sweat and rain from metal they barely understood. When the first engines turned over, the jungle trembled. Its nose was too long, its landing gear too tall. On the ground, it looked awkward, as if it had been built for the sky but forced to crawl. Pilots circled it like wary soldiers meeting a wild animal. They climbed into its cockpit with more caution than pride, gripping the stick as if it might bite. The moment the throttle opened, the Corsair surged forward like something unleashed. It did not take off. It pounced. The ground crews learned quickly to cover their ears. The roar of its 2,000 horsepower engine was deafening, but what followed was stranger still. As the Corsair climbed, air screamed through the wing root inlets, producing a high-pitched wail that echoed across the islands. The sound was both eerie and majestic, a mechanical howl that seemed alive. It did not take long for the name to spread, Whistling Death. At first, it was the Marines who called it that, half in awe, half in fear. The pilots knew it could save them, but also kill them if disrespected. The Corsair forgave no hesitation. It demanded instinct, precision, and courage. Across the ocean, Japanese intelligence dismissed the reports as exaggeration. "Another American boast," they said. But when the Corsair finally appeared over their positions, diving through clouds with that unmistakable scream, the laughter stopped. The Zero had met its opposite, not delicate, but brutal, not graceful, but unstoppable. A new sound now ruled the Pacific, not silence and surprise, but the whistle of dominance descending from the clouds. Title fades in. Japanese pilots were stunned when America's Corsairs ruled the Pacific skies. In 1942, the Pacific sky belonged to Japan. From the Aleutians to the Coral Sea, the rising sun stretched across every horizon. Wherever Allied aircraft rose to meet it, one silhouette waited for them. Slender, pale, and almost elegant. The Mitsubishi A6M-0. Its wings curved like a blade drawn from the sheath of the sky. To its pilots, it was not a machine. It was a spirit given form. The Zero was light, impossibly so. Its frame, built from duralumin alloy, weighed less than the engine of some American fighters. It turned in tight circles, climbed like a bird startled from rest, and struck before its enemy could even raise a defense. In the first 2 years of the war, it seemed unstoppable. Over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Java, Allied squadrons vanished under its guns. Pilots called it a ghost that turns inside your soul. It was faster, sharper, almost alive. To Japanese commanders, the Zero was proof of a deeper belief that technology and spirit were one. They saw each victory as a reflection of national character, not just engineering. "They build factories," one officer said of the Americans. "We build warriors." The Zero was that warrior's blade, a weapon of precision, grace, and devotion. Its pilots, many barely 20 years old, were trained to believe in its perfection and in their own expendability. Together, they formed the mythology of invincibility. But perfection, in war, carries a hidden flaw. The Zero's speed came at a cost. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no protection for the men who flew it. One well-placed bullet could turn it into fire. In the early days, that weakness was invisible, buried beneath skill and surprise. But every skirmish, every victory, carried a quiet debt that would soon come due. As the months passed, Allied pilots learned to watch, to adapt, to study the ghost that hunted them. The Zero's greatest strength, its agility, would also prove its undoing. In the face of evolving technology and new tactics, lightness became fragility, and grace became limitation. The sky was no longer a place for elegance, it was becoming a laboratory for endurance. The Zero's myth endured, even as its reality began to fade. To fight it was to confront beauty twisted by war, a reminder that skill alone could not withstand innovation forever. The Japanese still believed they ruled the heavens, but beneath that confidence, the first cracks had begun to show. Fade out. Across the ocean, in wind tunnels and drafting rooms, a group of American engineers were fighting their own battle, one not of speed, but of possibility. Their answer would not be graceful. It would be monstrous. In a quiet factory on the Connecticut shoreline, engineers at Vought wrestled not with an enemy, but with the laws of physics. Their task was impossible: to build a fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight the Zero, a machine already feared as perfection in motion. America's pilots needed speed, power, and range, but the engineers knew that achieving all three would mean something close to heresy. What they conceived was unlike anything that had ever flown. A massive 13-foot propeller, the largest ever mounted on a single-engine fighter, demanded wings so bent they seemed broken. The inverted gull design lowered the landing gear, reduced drag, and gave the plane its unmistakable silhouette. It looked unnatural, almost monstrous, as though it had been designed by the wind itself. Inside, they placed the heart of a giant, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and a torque so violent that test pilots described it as trying to pull the world apart. The numbers were intoxicating: 400 miles per hour, a rate of climb unmatched by anything in the Pacific. If it flew, it would change the war. But before it could change the war, it had to survive its own creation. The prototypes rattled and shook like wild animals in their cages. Wings tore from fuselages, controls jammed in dives. One after another, test pilots bailed out over the Atlantic, parachutes opening above wreckage that had once promised salvation. The engineers stood on the beach, watching the debris wash ashore, pieces of their dream scattered between sea and sky. Still, they refused to quit. Each crash became a lesson, each failure a line in the blueprint of progress. They filed and reshaped, welded and reinforced, until the monstrous airframe began to behave. It was no longer a design. It was an argument against limitation. The Corsair was born not from perfection, but persistence. To some it was madness, a fighter too heavy, too complex, too dangerous for a war that demanded reliability over brilliance. But to the few who saw beyond the chaos, it was something else entirely, a gamble on innovation itself. America was risking millions, and the confidence of its own pilots, on a machine that no one truly understood. One engineer wrote in his diary, "If it flies, the war will change. If it fails, we will have flown too close to God." The Corsair stood at the edge of both prophecy and ruin, an aircraft caught between science and faith, waiting for its first true believer to take it into battle. Fade out. Across the ocean, Japanese intelligence hears rumors of this new American fighter. Their officers laugh. They will not laugh for long. News travels strangely in war. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence officers sifted through intercepted American communiques. their rooms filled with the smell of cigarette smoke and paper ink. Somewhere in the cables, they found mention of a new American fighter, a machine delayed by technical failures, plagued by crashes, and deemed too unstable for carrier use. The officers smiled. Too complicated, they said. Typical of them. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was confirmation, not intelligence. They believed their way of war was purer, cleaner, an art, not an industry. The Mitsubishi Zero had carried them from triumph to triumph, its simplicity mistaken for immortality. Propaganda posters called it the eternal fighter, perfect in form, divine in purpose. American innovation, they told themselves, could not match Japanese discipline. From afar, the new American design appeared to confirm that faith. Reports from the front spoke of accidents, broken wings, pilots who could not land on their own ships. The Corsair, they said, was too fast for its own good, too wild for the calm hands of naval aviators, a failed experiment, a waste of time. But across the Pacific, another story was unfolding, one not written in reports, but in blood and sweat. On island airstrips hacked from coral and jungle, U.S. Marine pilots were quietly learning to tame their monster. Each flight was an argument between man and machine. Some ended in fire, others in revelation. Every crash taught something new: how to approach, how to roll, how to land without being thrown into the sea. Slowly, painfully, the Corsair began to yield its secrets. The Marines respected it the way one respects the ocean. Never conquered, only understood. They learned to ride its power instead of resisting it. Mechanics tuned engines by ear, adjusted the bent gull wings to perfection, and replaced superstition with science. What the Navy had rejected, the Marines turned into religion. To the Japanese, these early encounters seemed random, isolated bursts of new energy that could be dismissed as luck. But soon, pilots began reporting something unsettling. Dogfights that used to end in effortless victory now demanded caution. The blue American planes moved differently, climbing faster, diving harder, firing with a precision that seemed impossible. The first pilots who faced them returned shaken. The second wave often did not return at all. The Corsair did not ask for sympathy. It demanded respect. It was no longer an experimental failure, it was an education in humility. Each sortie was a lesson, each victory a correction to arrogance. And somewhere across the ocean, in the polished offices of Japan's Air Command, the laughter began to fade out. The next time the Japanese would meet the blue-winged fighter, it would not be through rumor or report, but through the sound of its guns, roaring over Rabaul. The Corsair came to the Pacific not as a weapon, but as a revelation. When it first touched the coral strips of Henderson Field and Bougainville, the men of the Marine Corps did not yet know what it was capable of. They only knew that something had changed. The air war over the Pacific, once defined by Japan's elegance and dominance, was about to become something far more brutal, a contest between instinct and innovation. At Guadalcanal, the first Corsair squadrons taxied through mud and steam, their wings glinting in the sun like blue steel. The pilots who climbed into them were young, farm boys, factory hands, sons of mechanics, men more familiar with dust than doctrine. They had read the stories of the Zero's invincibility, but they no longer cared. The moment the R-2800 engine thundered to life beneath them, they felt what no Japanese pilot could yet imagine: raw, unfiltered power. The Corsair climbed higher, it dove faster, it hit harder. Against the Zero's grace, it offered ferocity. The Marines learned to use that difference like a weapon. They stopped trying to turn with their enemy. They struck from above, from distance, from surprise. Boom and zoom, they called it. Hit once, hit hard, vanish. The era of elegant duels was over. At first, the Japanese didn't understand. They waited for the slow spirals of dogfight combat, the choreography they had perfected since China, where skill and patience decided victory. But the Americans never circled. They appeared out of the sun, dove with impossible speed, fired 8 50 caliber guns, and were gone before a counterattack could even begin. The skies became a place of ambush rather than artistry, and for the first time, the Zero, light, delicate, built for maneuver, met an enemy that refused to play its game. From the ground, the Marines watched their own faith evolve. What began as fear of a dangerous aircraft turned into near religious trust. They began to believe not just in the Corsairs engine, but in its defiance of limits. Pilots talked to it, cursed at it, treated it like a living thing. "It was wild," one veteran later said, "but it loved you if you respected it." Above the Pacific, the balance of belief began to shift. Japanese pilots once climbed with pride, certain of their superiority. Now they climbed in dread. They could hear the whistle of the Corsairs' wings before they ever saw it. That haunting scream the Marines had come to recognize as their own war hymn. When the blue shapes appeared against the clouds, even the boldest Zero aces broke formation and fled toward the sea. In Tokyo, reports arrived describing new American tactics. No warning, no duels, no mercy. Commanders dismissed them at first, calling them exaggerations. But to the men who fought under that wide, merciless sky, it was no myth. The hunter's faith, the idea that spirit and skill could triumph over industry and adaptation, was breaking apart. The Corsair was more than a machine now. It was philosophy made visible, precision through pragmatism, strength through simplicity. The Marines no longer worshipped victory. They studied it. They learned that survival was not about courage, but calculation. By the spring of 1943, the Zero's mystique had cracked. The same pilots who once dove laughing into battle now measured every engagement with fear. The Corsair did not chase them. It hunted them. The difference was not just technological, it was psychological. For the first time since the war began, the men of the Imperial Navy were no longer predators. They were prey. Fade out. Thousands of miles away, in the laboratories of Vault, engineers pored over combat reports. Every bolt, every angle, every death became data. The Corsair was about to evolve again, not through theory, but through blood. War has a way of turning blueprints into biographies. Every dented wing and shattered fuselage that returned from the Pacific carried a story, and Vaught's engineers read them like scripture. Reports arrived from Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Georgia, not in numbers, but in experience. Pilots described what worked, what failed, and what almost killed them. The Corsair was powerful, yes, but it was still unpredictable. To make it perfect, they would need to teach it how to survive, and how to let its pilots survive with it. The data that came back was written in blood. The plane's landing gear still buckled on uneven airstrips. Its nose still obscured the carrier deck on approach. It could kill a rookie before the enemy ever had the chance. But the Marines who flew it swore it was worth saving. They spoke of its speed, its ferocity, its ability to strike and vanish. To them, the Corsair was not a problem to be solved. It was a creature to be tamed. In Connecticut, Vaught's designers listened. They added armor plating around the cockpit and fuel tanks, protecting the men who had once been exposed to fire. They strengthened the landing gear, widening its stance to absorb impact. The wingtips, too long for the tight confines of carrier decks, were clipped, reshaped for compact storage and greater stability. Every change carried the echo of a lost pilot. Every adjustment was a eulogy made mechanical. Slowly, the monster began to learn discipline. Its power was still there, the savage torque, the whine of the propeller slicing air. But now it had control. Engineers joked that the Corsair was becoming civilized, though only just. It was tamer, but never tame. When the Navy finally agreed to retest it, the moment felt like a second trial before an old judge. A new prototype taxied onto a carrier deck, its wings folding outward like a challenge. The pilot curved his approach, correcting for the long nose, fighting the same physics that had once doomed it. The landing was rough, a bounce, a skid, a brief silence, and then, astonishingly, stillness. The Corsair had landed, not gracefully, but triumphantly. The rejection was undone. The same service that had cast it aside now claimed it as its future. The Navy reversed its verdict, declaring the Corsair carrier ready. What had been the ensign eliminator became the Navy's most advanced fighter. Within weeks, factories that had once slowed production now worked around the clock. Machines hammered, rivets sang, and the roar of the R-2800 echoed through the assembly lines. America's most feared aircraft was no longer an experiment. It was a doctrine of speed and resilience, forged by experience. From 1943 onward, the Corsair evolved in real time. Each new variant bore the fingerprints of the men who had flown before. Every plate, every bolt, every scar. It was a living record of combat, refined not by theory, but by consequence. And as it matured, so too did the men who flew it. They trusted it now, not because it was perfect, but because it had earned the right to be. The Corsair had been reborn, not in the quiet of laboratories, but in the heat of battle. It had learned from loss, absorbed every mistake, and come back stronger. Its rebirth was not designed on paper. It was engineered by blood. Fade out. Somewhere in the Pacific, a new squadron of Corsairs rolls onto the runway, their wings freshly painted, their pilots newly trained. Ahead lies Rabaul, Japan's fortress of the Pacific, and the moment the Zero will finally meet its match. November 1943. The Pacific sky above Rabaul burns white with sunlight and history. Below lies Japan's most heavily fortified base, the beating heart of its South Pacific empire. Rabaul's airfields hum with power, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men, and the belief that no enemy could reach this far, let alone survive. But that morning, the horizon darkens with blue shapes descending from the clouds. The Marines have come. Their Corsairs, bent-winged, heavy, and alive with the thunder of Pratt & Whitney engines, sweep in low over the sea. From below, they look like creatures rising from the deep, the blue of their wings merging with ocean and sky. Above them, the Zeros climb to meet the intruders, confident as always. For 2 years, the Japanese fighters have ruled this airspace. They have learned to read their enemies' movements like words on a page. They expect another predictable fight. But the Corsair is not predictable. At 15,000 feet, the formations vanish into cloud cover. The Japanese pilots lose sight of them. Silence. Then, from the sun itself, the attack begins. The Corsairs dive as one, guns blazing, their 650 caliber Brownings tearing through the air like lightning. The first bursts find their mark. Fuel tanks erupt, wings shear off, smoke coils downward. Within 10 minutes, the clear morning becomes a storm of steel and flame. The Zeros twist and turn, their old tricks failing against the new predator. Their light frames, once symbols of agility, now betray them. They cannot dive fast enough, cannot climb steep enough, cannot take the punishment. The Corsairs strike, pull up, roll, and vanish. The perfected rhythm of boom and zoom. It is not a dogfight, it is a dismantling. Japanese pilots later describe it as like fighting thunder. The Corsairs arrive without warning, strike without mercy, and disappear without form. Every pass feels supernatural. Every engine note a roar of inevitability. One ace, who had once flown over China and the Coral Sea, said later, "We did not meet planes, we met fate." From the ground, observers watch the battle unfold as if the laws of flight have changed. The Zeros still dance, still twist their way through the sky, but the dance no longer matters. Their grace cannot overcome gravity. For every Corsair that burns, 5 zeros fall. By noon, Rabaul's sky is littered with smoke trails and falling wreckage. The once invincible fortress is silent. Its defenders limp home on sputtering engines, their confidence shattered. In that silence lies a revelation. The age of the Zero has ended, not through numbers or luck, but through evolution. For the first time, Japan's pilots see their own reflection, their strength mirrored and surpassed. The Corsair carries not just American might, but American philosophy, power tempered by adaptation. Each improvement, each modification, each pilot's report has forged this moment. What began as a rejected prototype now rules the sky once thought untouchable. When the last Corsairs turn homeward, the horizon is empty. The hunters are gone, but their echo remains. A low, fading hum of engines, like the aftershock of a storm. Rabaul had been Japan's pride, its fortress, its myth. And here, over its own birthplace of supremacy, that myth was broken. The Zero's final chapter was written not in defeat, but in obsolescence, fade out. In the months that followed, the Corsair's scream would become the Pacific's new anthem, a sound Japan could neither match nor silence. Soon, the world would know it by a name whispered through the clouds, Whistling Death. By 1944, the Pacific sky had changed color. The soft gray of early war had given way to deep, brilliant blue, the shade of the Corsair's wings. From island to island, across endless ocean, that blue became a promise and a warning. The aircraft that once struggled to land now ruled every kind of air, escorting bombers, diving on ships, and sweeping over enemy airfields with mechanical grace and relentless purpose. The Corsair had grown into its destiny. It no longer fought for survival, it fought for dominance. In its engine's deep-throated growl and its wings' high-pitched scream, Japan's pilots heard the sound of something greater than technology. They heard inevitability. When the Marines began their long marches across the Pacific, Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas, it was the Corsair that shadowed them from above, striking anything that moved, clearing paths for men who could barely lift their heads from the heat. Its signature came not from sight, but from sound. The whistle, that sharp, haunting note, as air rushed through the inlets of its wings, announced its arrival before it could be seen. To American ground crews, it was music. To Japanese airmen, it was prophecy. They called it Ao Oni, the Blue Devil. It moved faster than thought and struck without warning. One pilot described its dive as the air itself turning against you. Among the Marines, the legend grew in darker humor. They said, "If you hear it, you're still alive." The whistle meant death for someone else, an enemy above or below. It was the voice of a machine that had transcended its flaws. From the decks of carriers to the muddy airstrips of the Solomons, the Corsair proved what the Zero could never be. A weapon that combined speed with strength, elegance with endurance. Its thick armor shrugged off fire that once tore through Allied planes. Its 8 machine guns carved lines of light across the sky, each burst precise and devastating. The Japanese, once masters of the air, now fought in defense of memory. Their aircraft still danced with the old grace, but they danced in retreat. The Corsair didn't duel, it executed. For every one lost, 5 zeros fell in flame. The numbers were cold, but the meaning was not. The age of spirit-driven war was ending, replaced by one defined by science, industry, and adaptation. What began as mockery had become mythology. The same bent-wing silhouette once dismissed as clumsy was now a symbol of invincibility. Its shape haunted every engagement, every pilot's dream. When a Japanese squadron spotted the blue glint of those wings in sunlight, they knew what it meant: the end of freedom in the sky. Even on the ground, the Corsair was a presence. Children in Pacific villages learned to look upward at its sound, that shriek of air tearing around power. To them, it was a monster. To the Marines, it was a guardian. It was not beautiful, but it was righteous. Its sound filled the air like thunder, and when the thunder passed, silence meant survival. The Corsair's dominance was more than tactical. It was psychological. The Zero's quiet hum had once symbolized control and discipline. The Corsair shattered that illusion. Its noise was its identity. Raw, mechanical, merciless. It declared that the future of air power would not whisper. It would roar. As 1944 drew on, Japan's pilots began to face not just defeat, but disbelief. They had once owned the sky, their names spoken like legends: Sakai, Nishizawa, Ota. Now they flew against ghosts wrapped in blue light. In their reports, they wrote of a machine that will not die, and of American pilots who fly as if the air belongs to them. By the time the Corsair swept through the Marianas, the contest was already over. The numbers, the factories, the fuel, all favored America. But more than that, the psychology of the war had shifted. Air superiority no longer belonged to silence and invisibility. It belonged to sound, to noise, power, and the will to use both without apology. In the Pacific, the sky was no longer sacred. It was mechanical, human, and loud. And its new ruler came screaming through the clouds, not as an angel, but as the echo of every mistake the enemy had ever made. Fade out. On the decks of the carriers, the pilots of the Navy watched the Blue Devils return from battle. Soon they will claim the Corsair as their own, and crown it the king of the fleet. By 1945, the ocean had become a moving city of steel. The Pacific, once ruled by scattered island airfields, now belonged to the carriers, floating worlds that brought war to every horizon. And upon their decks, another transformation was taking shape. The bent-wing fighter that the Navy had once rejected was returning home. The Corsair, tamed, refined, reborn, was ready to claim the crown it had been denied. Engineers had solved its riddle. The long, obstructive nose that once blinded pilots on approach now demanded a new ritual. The Corsair could no longer land straight in like other aircraft. Instead, it had to curve its descent, banking slightly to the left, giving the pilot a momentary glimpse of the deck before touchdown. It was an act of instinct and trust, a dance between danger and precision. Those who mastered it felt something few pilots ever did. They had tamed a legend. The same plane that had once bounced and shattered across carrier decks now touched down with grace. Not easily, not gently, but successfully. The landing signal officers, who had once dreaded its sight, began to wave it in with confidence. The ensign eliminator was gone. In its place stood the Navy's most versatile killer, fast, durable, and armed for every task the war could demand. On the open sea, the Corsair became more than a fighter. It became a multi-role weapon, a hammer with wings. It could escort bombers, dive on shipping, or strafe airfields with 8 machine guns blazing. With its folding wings, it fit neatly into the crowded decks beside the Hellcats and Avengers. But when it launched, it outflew them all. At Okinawa, its final proving ground, the Corsair's reign reached its height. The battle was brutal, unrelenting. and fought as much against the sky as against the sea. From dawn until dusk, waves of Japanese kamikazes hurled themselves at the Allied fleet, a storm of desperation and courage. The Corsairs met them head-on, their guns lighting the air like a second sunrise. The whistling death that had once haunted Japanese pilots now became the sound of salvation for American sailors. Over the course of the campaign, Corsairs downed hundreds of attackers. Their speed allowed them to intercept suicide planes before they ever reached the ships. Their armor let them survive hits that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Many returned to their carriers pocked with holes, hydraulic lines bleeding, engines coughing, but they returned. The machine that had once killed its own pilots now saved entire fleets. Veterans remembered the transformation with reverence. "She was wild once," one Navy pilot said. "Now she's loyal. You just had to earn her trust." In that line was the story of the Corsair itself, a weapon that mirrored the men who flew it, flawed at birth, perfected through endurance. The Japanese, watching from the remnants of their airfields, knew what the blue shape in the sky meant. The Zero, once a symbol of supremacy, was gone. In its place flew a predator that embodied everything Japan had underestimated: industrial might, mechanical learning, relentless adaptation. The Corsair didn't duel for glory, it hunted for purpose. By war's end, it had become both fighter and bomber, defender and destroyer. The pilots who flew it loved it, not because it was gentle, but because it was honest. It demanded respect and repaid it in survival. It was the rare machine that reflected the soul of its time, dangerous, efficient, and utterly without illusion. As the last battles of the Pacific drew to a close, the carriers stood unchallenged. The sea belonged to the Navy. The sky belonged to the Corsair. It had completed its evolution, from outcast to champion, from failed experiment to the perfect predator. What began as rejection had become redemption. The fighter that defied gravity had also defied expectation. And as peace crept over the ocean, the Corsairs sat folded on the decks in the evening light, wings bent like the arms of a resting bird. Fade out. The war was nearly over, but in the factories and flight lines beyond the horizon, a new struggle was already beginning, not of propellers, but of jets. By 1945, Japan's airfields had fallen silent. The song of the Zero, once the proud anthem of empire, had been drowned beneath the endless hum of American industry. What began as a contest of pilots and machines had become something far larger. The Pacific sky no longer belonged to aces, it belonged to builders. The Japanese aircraft industry, battered by raids, burned beneath American firebombs. Factories once filled with the steady rhythm of assembly were now ruins. Twisted steel, shattered glass, scattered dreams. Skilled craftsmen who once built fighters by hand now worked by candlelight, forging fragments of a dying war. For years, Japan had defined its strength through mastery, perfection of form, discipline of spirit. But mastery is fragile when the world begins to move faster than hands can shape it. In the skies above, the proof was visible in blue. The Corsair, that bent-winged storm of metal and will, was no longer a weapon built for one man's glory. It was an instrument of a nation's system, designed by many, built by thousands, perfected by all. Where Japan built aircraft like art, America built them like rivers, constant, unending, unstoppable. Across the United States, factories became runways of steel. Women and men worked in 3 shifts, sleeping in the glow of furnaces that never cooled. Each day, another Corsair took flight, sometimes 2, sometimes 20. Its parts were forged in dozens of cities. Wings from Akron, engines from Hartford, bolts from Detroit. In war's arithmetic, America had found its advantage not in invention, but in repetition. On Pacific Islands, the cycle became a rhythm. A Corsair would go down in combat, by flak, by fuel loss, by fate, and another would appear within days. Mechanics assembled replacements beneath palm trees, sometimes flying them before the paint had even dried. A single machine was expendable. The system was not. The Japanese pilots, who had once believed in duels of honor and precision, now faced an enemy that seemed eternal. For every 0 destroyed, 5 more Corsairs arrived. Their skill could not match the scale of what they fought. They began to understand that this was not just a war of courage. It was a war of construction. In Tokyo's Air Defense Command, one officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We built machines to honor the warrior. They built machines to replace him." It was not defeat of spirit, but of philosophy. The samurai ideal, where victory came from perfection, was collapsing beneath a new truth, that in modern war, perfection meant production. From above, the sky itself began to change character. It no longer carried the silence of one man's duel, but the constant roar of industry in motion. Every Corsair that streaked through cloud and sunlight was more than a plane. It was a symbol of the assembly line, of collaboration over individuality. And yet, within that noise, there was something human, the quiet ingenuity of those who had built it. The Corsair's bent wings were not a flaw, but a reminder of how innovation adapts to necessity. Its power came not from perfection, but from compromise, from the ability to bend without breaking. As Japan's defenses fell and its skies emptied, the Corsair became not just a fighter, but a prophecy. It represented a new era, where machines were not extensions of heroes, but of nations. The Pacific War had begun with faith in the lone ace. It ended with belief in the system. By the time the final missions launched, the outcome was already written, not in blood, but in blueprint. The Corsair had become more than a machine. It was an era cast in aluminum and steel, shaped by the hands of thousands who would never see the front, but won it all the same. Fade out. In the quiet that followed surrender, the survivors of both sides would look skyward, toward the same blue that had once divided them, and understand that the future of flight and of war now belonged to those who could build the fastest, think the widest, and learn the fastest. When the war finally ended, the men who had flown the Corsair spoke of it not as a machine, but as a creature, wild, unpredictable, and alive. They called it a monster, but a loyal one. "It was wild," one Marine veteran said, decades later, "but it loved you if you respected it." That respect was the difference between triumph and tragedy. In the beginning, the Corsair punished arrogance. It demanded total attention. A moment's carelessness meant disaster. It could torque roll on takeoff, stall in a turn, or slam a pilot into the deck with brutal indifference. But to those who listened, who studied its moods and rhythms, it revealed something profound, that mastery in war was not about domination, but about harmony. You didn't control the Corsair, you learned to coexist with it. Through that relationship came results no one could have imagined. Across the Pacific, Corsair squadrons claimed over 2,000 aerial victories for the loss of only 189 of their own. The numbers spoke, but not of luck. They told a story of discipline, of adaptation, of men who learned that technology could be as demanding a teacher as combat itself. In its cockpit, pilots discovered lessons that went far beyond the battlefield. They learned patience, to wait for the right speed before a turn, the right moment before a dive. They learned humility, to accept that even the most powerful engine in the world could betray them if handled without respect. And they learned teamwork, that survival was a collective effort, from the engineers on the ground to the gunners on the ships who guided them home through tracer fire and storm, every crash became instruction. Every wrecked fuselage was studied, every mistake recorded, and every improvement made not through pride, but through persistence. The Corsair, in its unforgiving precision, mirrored the very character of the men who flew it. It rewarded care, punished ego, and demanded discipline. It was not a tool of arrogance, but of education, and that education remade the men who climbed into its narrow cockpit. For many, the experience bordered on the spiritual. Pilots spoke of the feeling of being carried, not merely by wings, but by purpose. "You could feel it breathing," another veteran said. "The engine shook your bones, the stick fought your hands, but once you stopped fighting back, it lifted you like it wanted you to win." The Corsair was not kind, but it was fair. It asked everything, and gave back everything in return. By war's end, the bond between pilot and plane had become something sacred. The Marines who once cursed its brutal landings now polished its fuselage with reverence. The Navy, which had once rejected it, now called it indispensable. Across the fleet, stories spread of Corsairs limping home with holes in their wings, engines on fire, pilots wounded, and still landing safely. The machine had earned its humanity. The Corsair's record was more than a tally of victories. It was a reflection of character. It proved that success in war and in invention came not from perfection, but from endurance. It was a weapon that turned those who used it into better versions of themselves. And when the last sorties were flown, its pilots carried something home with them that no medal could represent: the quiet pride of having mastered not just a fighter, but themselves. The Corsair did not forgive arrogance. It punished the reckless, the hurried, the overconfident. But for those who met its challenge with respect, it offered greatness. That was its real gift. A machine that turned raw ambition into discipline, and discipline into victory. In the end, that discipline, not its speed or firepower, won the sky. Fade out. The war was over, but the Corsair's echo, the sound of its engine, the lessons of its cockpit, would follow its pilots into peace, shaping a generation that had learned, quite literally, how to fly through chaos and live. When the guns of 1945 finally fell silent, the Corsair did not fade with them. The war was over, but its story was not. For most machines, peace meant extinction. Engines cooled, propellers stopped, factories fell quiet. But the Corsair, the so-called whistling death, was too alive to die. Its wings, once symbols of destruction, now marked the beginning of something new, the era of transition. 5 years later, the sky above Korea burned with a different kind of fire. Jet engines screamed through the clouds, their speed almost beyond comprehension. Yet among them, slower, older, seemingly obsolete, the Corsair still flew. It fought jets, survived their dives, and outmaneuvered them in the thick, low air where instinct mattered more than thrust. Its pilots, veterans and newcomers alike, marveled that this relic of propellers could still carve victory from the modern world. In an age racing towards supersonic flight, the Corsair became an anachronism that refused to surrender. It was no longer the dominant predator, but it was still a survivor. Against Soviet-built MiGs, it proved that agility and experience could still defeat raw speed. Its silhouette, that unmistakable bent-wing design, cut through the jet age like a reminder of human craftsmanship. The machine that had once symbolized the future now stood as a bridge between two eras, the last of the propeller kings and the first whisper of the jet age. To the engineers who watched, the Corsair became a lesson in endurance. Its design, aerodynamic, unconventional, brutally efficient, shaped the next generation of aircraft. The swept wings of the jets that followed owed something to its innovation. Its balance between speed and control influenced more than one post-war blueprint. The Corsair had been born from failure, perfected in war, and carried forward by its own genius. Across the Pacific, in the ruins of Japan, another transformation was taking place. The same nation that once feared the Corsair now studied it. Japanese engineers examined captured airframes, disassembled engines, and traced wiring diagrams like students reading scripture. From that study came something remarkable: the birth of Japan's post-war aviation industry, built not on pride but on humility. The Corsair had been their enemy. Now it was their teacher. Defeat became education. Through imitation came innovation. The factories that once forged Zeros began to build machines inspired by the technology that had beaten them. The lesson was not about shame, but about progress, that even the instruments of destruction can carry seeds of creation. And so, the Corsair's legacy was not measured by its kills or its speed, but by its influence. Its echo could be heard in the rumble of every post-war engine, in the confident curve of every wing that dared to defy convention. Engineers learned that beauty in flight was not symmetry, but purpose. That form followed survival. By the mid-1950s, the last Corsairs were being retired, their paint chipped, their once fearsome whine fading into memory. But their sound, that haunting whistle born from pressure and air, lingered in the imagination of a generation. For many, it became the soundtrack of transformation, from the old world to the new, from piston to jet, from destruction to understanding. It was, in its way, the sound of the future, a reminder that innovation is never born in comfort, and that progress grows not from triumph, but from humility. Fade out. The skies had changed forever, but one truth remained. Every new machine carries the echo of the one that came before, and the Corsair's echo still sang through the jet stream. In the beginning, they laughed. When the first photographs of the Corsair reached Japanese intelligence, the reaction was disbelief and amusement. The new American fighter, they said, looked deformed. Its wings, bent sharply like a seabird caught mid-dive, seemed unnatural, even clumsy. "It cannot fly straight," one ace remarked. "They have built a mistake." To the pilots of the Zero, whose aircraft embodied the elegance of minimal design, the Corsair's crooked silhouette was proof that their enemy did not understand the art of flight. But arrogance is often the first casualty of innovation. What the Japanese dismissed as an aesthetic flaw was, in truth, a masterpiece of engineering, a shape born not from error, but necessity. Those bent wings allowed the Corsair's enormous propeller to spin freely, giving room for the most powerful piston engine ever fitted to a fighter. It was not a bird crippled by design. It was one taught to climb higher than anything before it. And climb it did. The bent-wing bird, as its pilots affectionately called it, flew faster, higher, and longer than its enemies could imagine. It turned ridicule into revelation. The very shape that once drew laughter became the outline of fear, a shadow cast across the Pacific. Stretching from the Solomons to Okinawa, to face a Corsair was to face progress itself. It was the machine that redefined the purpose of flight, no longer built to duel in graceful circles, but to dominate through speed, power, and resilience. Every curve of its frame, every note of its whistling descent, told the same truth. Survival was no longer about beauty, but adaptation. For Japan's pilots, the lesson came too late. The Zero, born of pride and tradition, had reached the limit of what human craftsmanship could achieve without compromise. It was fragile, romantic, and doomed. The Corsair, built through failure, rejection, and relentless improvement was its opposite: practical, ugly, unstoppable. In those differences lay the philosophy of two nations, one chasing perfection, the other chasing progress. By war's end, the skies themselves seemed to remember. The Zero's graceful hum faded into history, while the Corsairs' growl lingered, not just as a sound, but as an idea. It stood for every innovation mocked before its time, every risk mistaken for recklessness, every design that dared to break the rules and won. Its bent wings became a symbol of survival, the embodiment of a truth older than war itself, that evolution belongs not to the flawless, but to the flexible. In their twisted geometry lay the story of men and machines that refused to quit, no matter how absurd they once seemed. The Corsairs' victory was not only mechanical, but moral. It proved that humility, the willingness to fail, learn, and rebuild, was a greater strength than perfection could ever be. Arrogance had built the Zero. Resilience had built the Corsair. And when the laughter finally stopped, it was not because the war had ended, but because the lesson had been learned. In the decades that followed, the bent-wing bird became an icon of endurance, painted on murals, displayed in museums, remembered by the men who flew it and the men who feared it. It was the fighter that rose from rejection to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. They had laughed once. They never laughed again. Fade out. The Corsair's wings fold for the last time, resting not in defeat, but in legacy, proof that the sky does not belong to the beautiful, but to the brave.